Sounds like this can pick me up pretty well, so that's good. I'll try not to project too much like a teacher will do on occasion and make it so that it will reverberate, but then it's sometimes to keep you going, the reverberation is not a bad idea. I know that you've had a long and busy day, and some of you are spending time in a time zone that's completely alien, because you've got night now or day now versus what you would normally have. So I appreciate your willingness to be here and your participation in this conference. I know I'm very excited to share this time with you. One of my tasks was to try to put in a brief perspective of what the American Civil War was all about, and to talk a little bit about how that might fit into some of your themes for your conference. So I'm going to try to do that in the brief time that I have available, and that will be difficult. I talked to a colleague and friend of mine, James I. Bud Robertson at the Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, Virginia Tech. And I said, Bud, how do you cover the Civil War in one semester? He said, I don't. I have two. Unfortunately, I only have one at Kennesaw State University, and I have even less time here. But one of the things I thought I would talk to you a little bit about was the nature of the way that Americans understand their own Civil War, because I think you'll be surprised of the amount of knowledge that a lot of young people in college age have about the American Civil War. One of the things that I did was, when I first taught at the University of Georgia, I handed out a survey. And I asked my students to try to explain to me a number of things to the best of their knowledge at the front end of the class, before the class had actually started. And part of it was I wanted to understand what they knew coming in so that I knew what I was working with. One of my students in the survey wrote out on the years of the American Civil War that the war began in 1845 and ended in 1914. Well, in case you're not one of the people that gets the humor of that, the actual war is 1861 to 1865. But my students spread it out quite a bit. Now, one of the things that was mentioned a minute ago was about how the war only lasted 4 years. And that is true. The war itself only lasted 4 years, but the lead up into it lasted well before the war took place, and the ramifications are felt, as we've already noted, to this day today. So we're talking about a 4-year conflict that actually goes well beyond the parameters of 4 years. So one of the things I wanted to do today was to talk a little bit about what the war was about, why there was a war, then the nature of that war, the nature of that conflict to our best of our understanding, and understand that every interpretation is subject to counter-interpretations and other viewpoints. One interpretation is simply not going to be enough. If you think it is, try coming up with a name for the American Civil War. Some people in this part of the region like to prefer to call it the war between the states, emphasis being on the states. Some people refer to it as the war against Yankee aggression. Some people refer to it as the war for Southern independence. And there are literally dozens and dozens and dozens of prominent names and maybe hundreds of variations by the time you're said and done. So if you can't agree about what to call it, it's sometimes likely to be the case that you won't agree with what the reasons why there was a war, the way that that war was carried out, and the effects of that war once it was over. But one of the things I wanted to talk about today was a little bit about some of the views as they seem to hold that make sense, that are convincing to at least a significant number of those of us who study the American Civil War. So I'm going to go back and look at the pre-war period, and if you were one of my students, you would want to know what year is that. And I don't know that there is a particular war. In fact, if you look at the American Revolution, there are ways that you can examine that American Revolution, the War of American Independence, as a civil war, a war in which American patriots fought American loyalists. And so there are many wars in America's history where there are divisions within the American ranks themselves. And even the notion of America. You know, what is America? It's not just the United States. Of course, the Confederates would argue that the Confederate States deserves to be called America too. And of course, other people in North America and South America would argue that America is more than that as well. So we could debate all day long the parameters of our talk, but I think if you're going to look at the way that the war developed, you have to see a country that begins to see regionalism and sectionalism as more important than nationalism. Regionalism and sectionalism as being the sort of counterbalances, if you will, to a patriotic attachment to country. If I am more a Virginian than I am a member of the United States, what does that mean? If I say that the United States are as opposed to the United States is, what does that mean? And so when you look at the American Civil War, one of the things you want to come to grips with is not the way we look back at it today, but to the best of our ability, how we understand how people living then would have looked at the world that they were caught up in, the war they will eventually be caught up in. And I think, again, you'll find that there's lessons that can be applied. Now, I'll tell you right off the bat that if you think that you study history and you'll learn from it exactly what to do in the same circumstances that developed through the years, you're in trouble. History does not repeat itself. History does have moments where there are times where similar events occur, similar outcomes are accomplished. It's various points in our history where it does seem like history sort of cycles, it repeats itself. But in each one of those circumstances, the people are different, their worldviews, their ideologies, their ideologies are different, their understandings are different, and that's the case of the American Civil War as well. The people that lived in that time period simply did not look at the world exactly in the same way that we look at our world today. So when you're looking for lessons, you have to be careful to understand, to look at the lessons of history from the perspective of the people that are engaged in living that history and living those moments. And the American Civil War is another example of that. You can talk about the institution, for instance, of slavery. I do not think that if you take slavery out of the equation, you have an American Civil War. I'm not convinced that there are enough other issues that slavery absent would be, those other remaining issues would be sufficient for there to be a conflict between the North and South. That said, I do not believe that slavery was the only cause of the Civil War. To simplify the Civil War that much is to simplify it too much. Like all things in life, like all things that you live and you know from your own lives, life is complex, and the complexities are what actually make it rich and interesting. The complexities and the complications are what actually make it interesting. So when you study the American Civil War, again, slavery is going to be part of the equation. And when you look at slavery in the United States, slavery as it develops, slavery was one of those institutions that came to America early and remained, and of course continued to flourish in the American South, whereas in the North, in the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution, states began to move away from slavery. Once Congress put the Northwest Ordinances in place, one of those was designed to keep slavery out of the Northwest territories. If you're an American historian, you know Northwest is really Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, the kinds of places, Michigan, Wisconsin, the places like Dearborn that you've been to. The new Northwest is a little bit further out, Washington State, Oregon, and the like. But the old Northwest is that area east of the Mississippi, north of the Mason-Dixon line carried across. So when you look at the American Civil War, the United States begins to develop a system, really two systems that begin to compete with each other, and slavery becomes sort of the heart of the competition, the heart of the argument. Now you have to understand again that slavery would not work if it did not have, if it wasn't viable, if it wasn't economically viable. And of course we know that the cotton gin and the development of technology enabled cotton to be produced on a mass level. But slavery was not simply connected to cotton. I think that's another thing that people have a misnomer about. They think that the two go hand in hand. I wrote a book about the Civil War in the movies called Gone with the Glory, and one of the things I did was look at various movies and how they depict real history. And of course, I think you can probably guess they don't very often do a very good job. Quite often they compress things, or they use composite figures. They say things from the perspective of the times in which the movies were produced that say more about those times than they do about the history that they're supposed to be depicting. And that's true, I think, of almost everything we do. It's true of history. When you study, the types of questions you ask, the types of answers you look for are often shaped by the world in which you live, the heritage and background that you bring to the endeavor. One of the things that I think is very interesting, I talked a little bit about interpretation and how varied interpretations can be. Everyone seems to have one depending on what the subject or the topic is. I had an aunt, and I say aunt, A-U-N-T, but some of you from different parts might say aunt or something else. I had an aunt who lived in Richmond, Virginia. She was a great aunt, literally a great aunt, but she was also very, very wonderful. And she was a cook, and she had made all of her money as a caterer and as a cook. And then the Great Depression hit, and she lost it all. If she wrote a history of banking, it will not be the kind of history of banking that a banker would write, that someone from that perspective would want to offer. She never put another dime in the bank. That's the way she felt about what had happened to her. And that's the way we all are. We try our best to be objective, but we bring our baggage, if you will, our subjectivity to our studies as well. It's just part of our nature. Human beings and historians are one and the same. So when you're trying to look back and understand why people did what they did, again, looking at the Civil War era and try to understand it, condemning someone because they're a slaveholder, condemning slavery as an evil, certainly there's no question about that. There's no debate about that. There's no sense that that's not true. And yet it's not very satisfying to explain how slavery became so important a part of the American South. It's not satisfying to understand why that disagreement over the institution of slavery led to such ultimate hostility between North and South. When you look at slavery itself, I think most white Southerners would have probably used the phrase, it was a necessary evil. Where they changed that viewpoint, something that the system that existed, that you have to work with, that you have to live with, where they changed that viewpoint is where slavery became increasingly under attack. And as slavery came increasingly under attack in the antebellum period, the period before the American Civil War, then many white Southerners began to rally around it. Now, not all did, but slavery went from a viewed largely as a necessary evil, just the way things are, to a positive good, that you could begin to explain that it had benefits and positive aspects to it. And preachers in pulpits, politicians at various meetings, and individuals in taverns and barn raisings and everything else that would talk about the institution of slavery increasingly found ways to justify it, increasingly found ways to explain it in a way that made them look less bad. One of the ways you can do that is by emphasizing something known as paternalism over profits. Paternalism over profits. What that means is that if you feel that the good Lord has created a world, and in that world there are those who are supposed to be on top and those who are not, it is the obligations of those on top to look after, guide, guard, and protect those at the bottom. If you go back to an ancient idea in Europe, the idea of the great chain of being, all of that makes sense. That things are ordered, that there is a hierarchical system in place, and those at the top are there for a reason, imbued with certain characteristics and certain values that they then are going to impart on those that come under their responsibility, under their charge. If you look at the modern police car, you see two phrases joined together: to protect and to serve. If you go back to this notion of a hierarchical society, there were those above whose responsibility was to protect those below. there was the same obligation, in fact, a mutual obligation to serve those above. Well, it doesn't take long to build an entire system in which those who are on top, who also, by the way, happen to be the ones in the legislatures and the governor's offices and so forth, for them to be able to explain slavery in a way that makes slavery, we'll just say, look less bad or less evil. Now, ultimately, the United States really divides over the question of the expansion of slavery. It's not so much the eradication of slavery as the expansion of slavery. As America undergoes what people popularly call, what was known at the time as manifest destiny, the idea that America would spread from sea to shining sea and everywhere in between, that this kind of spread brought civilization and progress and Christianity and other elements with it, that it also brought slavery, at least potentially. And one of the big arguments through the antebellum period, the period just prior to the American Civil War, is going to be over whether slavery ought to expand. I'm not going to try to predict, but I would imagine that Abraham Lincoln might tell you tonight something about slavery and how he viewed the institution of slavery. I can very much predict that there were opposite views. There were different views on the other side, including views by people that will be prominent on the Confederate side of the ledger. Confederate States of America, after all, will have a vice president from Georgia named Alexander Stephens, who talks about slavery being the cornerstone of the Confederacy. So if something has to be supported, championed, considered to be a positive good because of the benefits that can be derived, social and other benefits, economic benefits that can be derived, you can imagine if someone else comes along and says that slavery must not expand, cannot be allowed to expand, you're on a collision course. One of the things Abraham Lincoln famously will talk about is a house divided. Again, I'm not going to try to give away any of his comments, but a house divided against itself would at least have to figure out which way that house is ultimately going to lean, or how it's ultimately going to stand lest it fall. And in the case of the American South, the notion was that slavery had to continue to expand or it would die. Cotton, tobacco, other types of products are very difficult on soil. And one of the things that happened in the age before a great deal of fertilizers and other things that modernized the ability to make soil productive again, to make land arable again, is that you have people continue to move to new land, to new areas where they can take their crops, where they can take their society, their social structure with them. And slavery was one of those pieces, one of those elements that went with it. From the Southern perspective for white Southern slaveholders, that was just a part of the way things should be, the way that in America things were meant to be. For the North, it quickly became the notion that if you're ever going to ultimately challenge and maybe abolish slavery, you have to at least begin to stop its progress, stop its expansion. That's part of the problem that you have, where you have a section that largely is not necessarily what you would think it would be. The North, you might think, would be abolitionist and united behind that. That was not the case. Most Northerners were not outright abolitionists. In the South, most white Southerners did not own even one slave. Most white Southerners did not own even one slave. And yet slavery was part of the Southern way of life, part of the Southern institutions. And in the North, if you were going to have something that you promoted and you elevated, that would have to stand the test against the slave system that competed. What you saw in the North was something that historians, and Eric Foner is the most famous of those, most well-known of those, talked about something called free labor ideology or ideology. Free labor ideology does not mean that you work for nothing. It means, though, you have choices. You have the opportunities to improve yourself. Now, I can tell you that as soon as I get through the kinds of things that many high-powered political figures in the North believe, I can point to you any number of lower-level, ordinary citizens who said, well, that doesn't seem to apply to me. And that's the way life is. When you talk about the northern free labor ideology, you're really talking about promoting and selling capitalism. The idea that you're going to make profits, you're going to use those profits to improve your position, to go from a worker to an owner, whether you own land or you own your own home or farm or your own business, and you're going to slowly work your way up. So the idea of upward mobility was crucial. The idea that you can have progress in society. The feeling was that the white South, the slave South, was stagnant. It was economically caught in a bind, and slavery was the binding element. That Southerners were inherently lazy, because after all, they had other people to do their work for them, and did not champion the idea of work. For them, work was a four-letter word not being a nice word. So the whole point, of course, is that when you look at the North that is trying to promote its idea of what a society ought to be, and it then tries to put that up against, juxtapose that against a Southern society that it believes is the antithesis or opposite of that, then the problem is that you can't, there's no room for give, there's no room for compromise. You know, one of your themes talks about how you can reconcile. Well, of course, reconciliation requires you to not conciliate to begin with. And if you look at the American South, increasingly the language is hostile and violent in its expression. The actions themselves. There was a congressman, a United States congressman named Preston Brooks, who took umbrage, who took exception to a comment made by a United States senator named Charles Sumner. Sumner was from Massachusetts and had condemned the institution of slavery, had said that it was the harlot that the South had attached itself to, and had slandered not only the Southern way of life that was connected to slavery, but individuals who had defended the South or defended slavery at various points. One of those was a senator from South Carolina named Andrew Butler. Preston Brooks was Andrew Butler's kinsman. In the South, increasingly, when attacks came, the ability to sort of slough those off or let those pushed aside was not a tendency that many Southerners, and unfortunately many in important places, were willing to undertake. One of the things Preston Brooks did was to become a living symbol, a living embodiment of a concept called Southern honor. Honor in this case depended on what other people think of you, and their expressions about you determine your own feeling of self-worth. To take insults was to do something to diminish yourself. And so the very last thing you could do was allow someone to get away with that with impunity, to get away with insulting you without a challenge or response. Now, of course, you probably heard, or certainly maybe seen, in the South, in American South, the famous idea of dueling. The problem with dueling is that one has to be with someone else who will be willing to duel with you. And you have to believe that that person is at least your equal in every regard. In the case of Charles Sumner, there would have been no attempt by Charles Sumner to engage in dueling, and Preston Brooks would not have looked at Charles Sumner as his equal or someone that he should be treating in that fashion anyway. So how do you teach someone like Charles Sumner good manners? How do you teach someone like Charles Sumner, who's attacking the South, attacking the institution of slavery, attacking your own family and your belief system? How do you teach someone? You walk into the Senate chambers. You do, by the way, wait until it clears of business and bystanders. There were actually a couple of young ladies that were lingering, and Preston Brooks waited until they were gone. But then he strode over to the desk where Sumner was sitting, and he took his cane, a gutta percha cane, and he lashed him over the head with that cane repeatedly, blow after blow after blow. As Sumner rose up to defend himself, he actually wrenched the desk up out of the ground, the floor where it had been bolted down, and ultimately collapsed. The thing that probably saved Charles Sumner's life was the fact that the cane shattered into dozens of pieces, and Preston Brooks could not continue the attack. Preston Brooks will be censured. He will be sent home. But the people of South Carolina are so proud of what he's accomplished, so proud of what he has done, that they send him dozens of canes to replace the one he broke. And they send him even more for ornamentation over the fireplace. One of the pieces that is sent to him, one of the canes says, "Use knock-down arguments." One of them says, "Hit him again." So you can imagine that when you have that much emotion caught up in these confrontations, that you can imagine warfare is not long down the road. We don't have time to get into every piece or element of what leads to the American Civil War. But ultimately, the Americans from the South, American South, decide that their best interests, at least enough of them. By the way, another thing that's interesting about the Civil War is not everyone in the Confederacy will be a Confederate. There were a lot of Unionists at various points throughout the Confederacy. West Virginia today exists because of Unionism in Virginia. But Virginia itself was a reluctant participant in what happened in the American Civil War, at least at the very beginning, as it was coming forward, as it was coming on. Virginia actually even voted against secession, trying to keep the Union together as much as possible. What is it that ultimately drove someone out of the Union? By the way, the people that were pushing the most for taking the future Confederate states out of the Union, the southern states, were called fire eaters. Fire eaters were the ones who used the hot expressions and verbalizations to try to target and attack their opponents. But they also spent a lot of time attacking their fellow Southerners. In some cases, they were such hotheads that they were not convinced that the Southerners that were not as hot-headed as them were doing what the South needed. They were behaving the way Southerners ought to behave. The hotheads, the fire eaters, wanted all Southerners to join lockstep. There were those who had hoped that the South, if it seceded, would go out together as a unit. They thought that that would be the better way to accomplish secession, breaking away from the Union and creating a whole new national state. In the case of that group, they were called cooperationists, not just because they wanted to cooperate with the North. That wasn't really what they were concerned about. They had already determined they were not going to cooperate with those people, but they would cooperate with each other in trying to orchestrate a united secession of more than one state. Well, that's not how it ended up happening. One state led the way, and that state was South Carolina. It led the way after a presidential election, the election of 1860. When you think about the consequences of elections, you don't have to look far across our globe. Those of you who know what the news shows almost every day, or what you yourself might be experiencing or seeing in your own country, will know how elections can have all kinds of results and outcomes. For the election of Abraham Lincoln as President of the United States of America was enough to convince South Carolinians that their way of life could not continue to coexist with a Republican-dominated government. And their frequent phraseology, again, if you want to tie in some of these things that we've talked about, was they frequently referred to Lincoln as a black Republican, constantly connecting those two ideas. Abraham Lincoln, of course, was not the first Republican to run for president. John C. Fremont had run for president in 1856, but the party had only existed for 2 years prior to that. And here in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, the Republicans, going to win. So you think about a party that went from nowhere to the White House fairly quickly. And there was certainly a lot of belief among many white Southerners that that trip was going to spell the end of their way of life as they saw it. So South Carolina seceded, and the other Deep South states seceded as well. The first wave of secession created a group of people that formed a government, that created a constitution, that elected provisional leadership. One of the things that's interesting, if I was in college and took the Confederate constitutional writers in, I would take them to honor court for plagiarism. Because one of the things you'll see in the Confederate Constitution is a great deal of copying of the United States Constitution. But the Confederates would have told you that that was because the United States had taken their Constitution away from its proper path, and that they were the ones who were actually bringing the Constitution back to the way it ought to be. So when you look at the Confederate Constitution, you'll be struck, I think, by how similar it is to the United States. But one thing you'll see over and over again is a clear and stated inclusion of the term slavery or some variation of it. Confederate Southerners were not at all bashful about making sure that people understood one of the core values of the Confederate government. Now, one of the other things I wanted to do was to talk a little bit about the nature of the war, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that, but I think that there's some important points. I think the first important point you have to understand is that nobody knew what they were getting into. The people who had some experience, some martial experience, some military experience, understood what war could do, but even they did not understand war on the scale that the United States of America and Confederate States of America are going to experience when they fight with each other. Some of the first battles, some of the first fighting was in fact much more similar to what you would have seen in the wars the United States had been in before. The scale was small, the number of casualties few. One prominent Confederate made the argument that when this was over, you could probably soak up the amount of blood spilled with a pocket handkerchief. Well, of course, that's not going to be the case when the war actually was finally over. No one knew how it would end. No one knew in what fashion it would end. And no one knew really precisely how to wage it. They knew that one of the first things you had to do was get large numbers of people involved. But that meant with a small professional army that you're going to have to just depend largely, almost substantially, on volunteers. And volunteers in the first days after Fort Sumter and the call of Abraham Lincoln for 75,000 volunteers to respond to the Confederate firing on of the fort in Charleston Harbor, those rush of volunteers were sufficient for the time being. It's kind of interesting if you read letters from the period that you'll see people making the comment about bringing in extra troops or bringing in extra supplies. One of the things that's even talked about a little bit is whether African Americans might be brought in as potential Confederate volunteers. And the comments are made fairly quickly and clearly that they're not needed. And frankly, if you're a Confederate, they're not wanted either at this stage. That will change. By the time the war is over, there are very different views about African American participation in the southern side of the American Civil War. But textbooks like some that have appeared in Virginia that say that Stonewall Jackson had black Confederates are simply wrong. The African American participation in the war comes very late and very reluctantly on the Confederate side. One of my favorite Confederates is a man by the name of Patrick Ronan Claiborne. Pat Claiborne was an Irish expatriate who ended up being a Confederate general. And Pat Claiborne actually at the end of 63 and into 64, 1863-64, is going to propose an idea that the Confederacy, desperately needing manpower by that point in the war, should turn to African Americans to help fill the ranks. That proposal is very much rejected at that point. A year later, people have changed their minds. Their consideration for that possibility is much different. But at least one prominent Georgia politician, a man by the name of Howell Cobb, suggests that if African Americans could make good soldiers, then all of our notions about slavery are wrong. Of course, his notions about slavery, you could say, were wrong. But that was not what he was intending to say. That was not his intent when he made that comment. He didn't believe that African Americans could make good soldiers. There were Union generals, not the least William Tecumseh Sherman, who didn't stray far from that point of view either, by the way. It's certainly not a united front in celebrating the arrival of African American troops when that possibility is over. But that's just one of the changes that the South faced, the American South faced. In some ways, the old South as it was doesn't go much past the very first major battle of the war, First Manassas or First Bull Run. From then on, the Confederate States of America, a country built on this whole notion of states' rights, the notion of individualism, is actually the first of the two combatants to engage in conscription, drafting its people into war. It has leaders who suspend the writ of habeas corpus. We know that Abraham Lincoln will do that as well. The declaration of martial law in areas where it's deemed to be important and critical. But these are not things you would have expected the Confederacy to embrace. These are not things you would have expected a Confederate government to do. The Confederacy actually undergoes a revolutionary change that it did not intend and frankly did not necessarily want. It was the demand of a modern war that required them to take steps that in many ways made a government that looked more like the government they had just argued was deserving of their separation from it. Those are some of the great ironies of the American Civil War, that the American system itself undergoes such a fundamental change. Abraham Lincoln, I'm sure will mention tonight about the Emancipation Proclamation. His original views, although he abhorred slavery, there's no question that Lincoln was against slavery. Don't read me wrong on that. But what he was a great politician. Comment was made a few minutes ago about President Abraham Lincoln being the greatest American president, and he may very well be. He's certainly one of the greatest politicians because he knew how to do what needed to be done. One of my favorite Abraham Lincoln stories is a story about Lincoln after the first wave of volunteers has run through and you need more because the battles continue to be fought and the blood continues to be spilled. And Abraham Lincoln has closed the recruiting stations so that one of the things that would happen if you were Abraham Lincoln is you would look like you were vacillating. You would look like you were backing down. You were changing your mind. We'll use the modern famous phrase flip-flopping. Flip-flopping. If you reopen the recruiting stations. So wisely, he got Republican governors to request that those recruiting stations be reopened because there was such a call from the people for the recruitment to resume. And so Lincoln very wisely said, I have to respond to my war governors, my Republican governors, and reopen the recruiting stations. I can tell you that Jefferson Davis, given his notions, given his personality, would have left them closed and they would have never reopened just to make a point. He was that determined that once he made up his mind, that was the way it was going to be. Jefferson Davis is a much different type of person than Abraham Lincoln, and the South in many ways experienced both good and bad, more bad because of that. So when you have a changing war, a war in which the country itself is modernizing and industrializing, even in the Confederacy, urbanization is taking place. Even in the Confederacy, industrialization is taking place. Technological advancements are occurring. One of the things that will happen not too far up the coast from where we are here in Savannah, that will happen in Charleston, is the attempt to use a submarine to sink an enemy ship, and in fact, sink an enemy ship in combat. One of the figures that went out on one of the test runs of the Hunley was my great-great-great-great-grandfather, who went into the Hunley because he was curious about it and wanted to know how it worked and volunteered to take another man's place when the other man couldn't get off of his duty. Well, my great-great-great-great-grandfather went in the Hunley only to have the backwash of a steamer come by, flood into the Hunley and sink it. When he got to the bottom, because he had worked his way up to where he could get to the hatchway, the hatch cover came down on his leg, and he literally went to the very bottom with the Hunley. And when he reached the bottom, he was able to take the pressure, was able to release just enough, but he was able to take the hatch off of his leg, the hatch cover, and swim to the surface. Now, he didn't volunteer to go back, and unfortunately, that ship didn't finish taking the lives of its own Confederate crew members. But those were the kind of innovations that the Confederacy was willing to try to undergo. The creation of the Monitor and ironclads on the Union side. The ability to revolutionize health care and medical attention. Antietam will be the single bloodiest day in American history for the combatants who were killed, wounded, and captured or missing. When that day is over, it becomes crystal clear that the old ways of taking triage and taking people and taking care of them have to change. So you see attitudes change because of the war. The war initially starts with the notion of a gentleman's war, of a war in which there are going to be limited objectives, limited outcomes. By the time you get to the latter part of that war, 1863, 64, and then into early 1865, that war has turned to a total war of attrition, wearing your opponent down, a total war that will involve all aspects of society. You may have heard of William Tecumseh Sherman that I mentioned earlier. William Tecumseh Sherman, famous for a march that took him from the Atlanta area, or north of it, down to this very city in the March to the Sea, and presented Savannah as a Christmas gift to Abraham Lincoln after he cut a swath through Georgia that Georgians, quite frankly, still remember. When you talk about the ramifications, when you talk about what happens as a result of the war, keep in mind that there are a lot of bitter feelings, a lot of antagonisms that will not simply go away once the hostilities have ended, once the formal engagement has ceased. I'm going to finish with just a view of one individual that I think you'll find fascinating. I wrote a book about a fellow by the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Forrest was a very definitely warrior-type individual. There's no question about that. He led men from the front. He carried men into battle himself. That was the way he did things. By the time the war was over, he had 29 horses killed from beneath him because he rode into combat on top of horses that so often didn't survive. He will kill in hand-to-hand combat 30 enemy soldiers. There was no question that he believed that the best Union individual, the best Yankee, was a dead Yankee. We'll just say it that way. But I will say this about Nathan Bedford Forrest. The very man who is going to be a bane of the existence of Sherman, Ulysses Grant, and many others, is going to be the model of reconciliation once the war is over. As the war wound down, he is confronted by politicians who want him to continue to fight. His line to them is that anyone who wants to continue a further prosecution of this war is a fit candidate for a lunatic asylum and ought to go there immediately. There was no doubt that Forrest would have fought tooth and nail to the bitter end, and yet he recognized that having done everything that could be done, he had lost. John Mosby recognized that. James Longstreet recognized that. Forrest was lucky. Mosby and Longstreet are ostracized by fellow Southern whites because they recognized the war had ended and they had lost. And their notion was that the smart thing to do would be to work with the winners, to work with those who did. Forrest was less demonstrative about it. When the fighting was over, he will go into private business again as a businessman, but also a farmer. And he will try to give contracts to laborers that will encourage the laborers to come to him. In other words, he's going to give them the better contracts that he can possibly give them, better than other of his competing planter friends. The planter friends don't like that. They don't want the workers to have that kind of power. They want the owner, the farm owner, to be the one that has that power. But Forrest wants workers, and he wants to do whatever it takes to accomplish that. So one of the things that's interesting is here's a man who fought war as hard as he did, makes a comment at one point, I did everything I could to break up this union, but having failed in that accomplishment, I will do everything I can to sustain it, and meant it. The person that probably is the most famous of these notions, of a person who said the war is over and we must move on, you will meet on Thursday, Robert E. Lee. And he certainly becomes a model of reconciliation himself in a very different way than Bedford Forrest. But I would say it's just very fascinating to see a war that built up such antagonisms and such hostilities, and in which, frankly, there is still some lingering feelings even today, nevertheless found a way to move on. And one of the things I do think that they were able to do is to recognize that both sides had struggled valiantly, both sides had done as much as they could to sustain the sides and the causes that they believed in, and both sides deserve to be respected for their willingness to sacrifice and for their endeavors, especially on the battlefield. I think the veterans were the ones who helped to bring the country back together. Veterans who ultimately laid aside the bloody shirt, as it was called. When you wave the bloody shirt, you remind people of the war and what's happened and who's responsible. Or, frankly, veterans who laid aside their antagonisms toward damn Yankees and finally understood that hating the other side only carries you so far. One of the final words I guess I will say is that peace was as complex as what led to the war and the war itself. It is still a work in progress in some ways. It's ironic, though, when you look in some sections of the American South and see Confederate flags waving, those are places that boasted Unionists in the time of the Civil War. I always found that most ironic. Maybe at the end of the day, we're just a nation of contrarians. Thank you very much.